All right. Thanks. Open your Bibles to 2 Timothy chapter 1. 2 Timothy chapter 1. Beginning with verse 16. The Lord give mercy unto the house of Onesiphorus, for he oft refreshed me, and was not ashamed of my chain. But when he was in Rome, he sought me out very diligently and found me. The Lord grant unto him that he may find mercy in the Lord in that day. And in how many things he ministered unto me at Ephesus, thou knowest very well. As I said this morning, there are only two passages in the entire Bible that even mention Onesiphorus. Only two passages. The other one we will look at in a minute, but it's very, very short. The only thing we know about Onesiphorus is in these verses and then over in chapter 4 and verse 19. We know a little bit about him in history, but what I read in history about him is very much based on speculation. It's based on probabilities, and some of the things that history says about him are very questionable at best. I want to look first of all at the man. We'll look at, he was a family man. We will look at specifically what he did. And then we will close with some lessons for you and I hope. First of all, he was a family man. In 1 Timothy chapter 10, that can't be right. Let me see what I was supposed to have written down. First of all, there aren't 10 chapters in 1 Timothy. So obviously I got that wrong, but it's in our text. That's where it is. I totally mistyped that one. Forget the Mr. Universe this morning. I'm obviously very human. Notice in verse 16, it said, the Lord give mercy unto the house of Onesiphorus. Chapter 4, verse 19, salute Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. So he was a family man. The word house simply means family. And all of those that would be in his household, those of his family, his kindred, the Lord blessed them. And be sure that when you're there, greet Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. They were known far and wide as a family, a household that was dedicated to the service of God. Now, in thinking about Onesiphorus and the fact that he had a house and a household, marriage changes us. Let me see who is not married. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that are not married. No matter what they say, marriage changes things. It changes the whole situation. Give me a couple of verses, and I'll get my mind back in after 1 Timothy 10. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 32, but I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. Paul's not condemning that. He's simply saying this is the way it is. In verse 33, verse 34, there is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. There's a lot of responsibility that goes into being married, and I'll have a purpose for this later on. You know, Paul talks about the relationship of a husband and a wife. A husband is to love the wife even as Christ also loved the church. He is to love the wife as his own self. So there are many clear-cut, absolute principles that once you marry, you do have certain obligations and responsibilities that go with marrying and maybe having children. Paul wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So when you marry, there are responsibilities. As a husband, you're responsible to love and cherish and care for your wife. You're responsible to provide for your household, your family. But even though he was married, Onesiphorus still found a way to be a blessing. Notice, because of Onesiphorus, his faithfulness, his dedication, his service, it said, the Lord give mercy unto the house of Onesiphorus. In other words, his house was blessed because he put God first. Notice what Onesiphorus did. And the more I got into this, the more I realized there was to get into. What he did was important. But when he did what he did was even more important. You know, sometimes you can give someone something or give a word of encouragement, and that's good. But sometimes when you give that word, when you go that second mile, is even more important than what you did. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, if you turn over a few pages, in chapter 4, verse 16, Paul is writing to young Timothy. And he said, at my first answer, no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. Paul had been deserted, forsaken. He was in the Roman prison. And history indicates that in 1 Timothy, he was in prison. He was temporarily released. He went over into modern Spain, and over in that area, carried the gospel. Then he was rearrested, put back in jail, and that's where he is now. At his first answer, everybody deserted him. All men forsook him. In 2 Timothy 1:15, the verse prior, that this thou knowest, that all they which are in Asia be turned away from me, of whom is, Phygellus and Hermogenes. So he's in prison for the second time. and everybody has turned away from him. Have you ever just felt totally all alone? You feel like nobody cares. This is the worst time of my life, and when I need people the most, instead of standing with me, instead of being there for me, all they which are of Asia forsook him. No man was willing to stand up with him as he faced Nero and potentially thrown into the lion's den. It's easy to stand for God and for his men when everything is going well. It's easy to stand for God when everybody around you is standing. But when everyone has fled, everyone has deserted you, everyone has turned against you, those can be some very hard, difficult times. Onesiphorus, at that time, when Paul was perhaps at the lowest moment, when everybody had left him, he was in a damp, dungy Roman prison by himself, Onesiphorus sought him out. This was a normal pattern for Onesiphorus. Many people say, let's just take it easy and we'll visit Paul when things go better. But Onesiphorus, this was his pattern. This was his life. In verse 16, for he oft refreshed me. It wasn't just this one time, but he was often refreshing Paul and helping Paul. In verse 18, in how many things he ministered unto me, thou knowest. This was a standard procedure for Onesiphorus. He was one of those people that naturally did what he could to be a blessing and a help to others. He refreshed Paul, and I'll cover that in a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds. He ministered unto Paul. He provided for Paul. He provided physical needs for Paul. There are just some people that it's just natural. They don't have to think about it. They don't have to meditate on it. It just comes natural that when they see a need, they jump in and help any way they can. Whether it be financial, whether it be physical, or whether it be like Onesiphorus, he oft refreshed me. I thought about that phrase. Proverbs put it this way: as in water, face answereth to face, so the heart of man to man. In Ecclesiastes, Solomon again wrote, two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him. I was reminded of this. It was last week, last week, meaning actually Friday before last. I was home and still very weak very unstable. And I went to the restroom, and somehow or other, I lost my balance. And I fell completely backwards. I tried to grab onto everything. I went all the way down. And if you don't believe it, my wife has a picture of the hole in the wall where my head hit when I went down. But the funny thing is, and my wife just about died laughing, it wasn't funny to me. Somehow, in the position that I fell in, my legs were propped up at a bent angle, and I could not lower my legs. I'm laying there on my back, trying my best to lower my legs, trying to get my legs down so that I can stand up. If it had been on video, it would have won first place in America's Funniest Videos. But here I am laying on my back. My head's inside of the wall. My feet somehow were stuck, and I didn't have anybody to help me up. I finally figured it out, but it was a good while before I did. So if one falleth, the other will lift him up. But woe be to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. My hearing aids are programmed that any time I fall over so many inches in so many seconds, it automatically calls my wife. I had just taken my hearing aids out. But woe to him. Again, if two lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. In other words, if we're going to be successful, we need a companion. We need someone who can lift us up when we're down, physically or spiritually. We need someone who can be there with us, for us, and just help us out of that down position. And when the enemy attacks, and he will, it's a lot easier to stand if you have a good friend standing by your side. In the New Testament, one of the things that, if you've ever studied Jesus sending out the apostles and then later sending out the disciples, Jesus never sent the disciples out in groups of less than 2 people. You don't find Barnabas and Saul, Paul and Silas, always in at least 2, so that one could encourage the other. One could lift up the other. One could reach down and say, hey, I want you to know, as you're going into battle, I'm right here with you. Don't tell me you're standing behind me. Sometimes you need somebody to stand with you. I've always said, when people said, I'm behind you, I wait for the knife to go in, because, if they're behind you, what we need are people like Onesiphorus, who will go to Paul where Paul is and will refresh his spirit and often minister unto him. You ever notice depressed people? Maybe you've been here. I know I certainly have. When somebody gets depressed, more than just a few minutes or few hours, they begin to withdraw and they want to be alone. They begin to withdraw from church. Then they begin to withdraw from family and friends. And let me tell you, that is the absolute worst thing you can possibly do. When you're in a valley and you feel so low that you can't even imagine ever feeling good again, you don't need to withdraw. You need people like Onesiphorus who will refresh your soul, who will minister unto you. Many a phone call, text, or even email, many a card or letter can often refresh the spirit of someone who is struggling. You know, one of the great tactics Satan uses, you're all alone. That is one of the worst feelings you can ever have. But like Onesiphorus, we need to be willing to sit down and do what we can to refresh those like Paul, those who are in prison, those who are in distress, those who are facing calamities. Sometimes what they need is somebody to come along and refresh them. Refresh them. Notice Paul said he sought me out diligently, and he found me. He didn't say, well, I looked and I didn't find him. I'm going back home. Now remember, he has a family. He's got probably a wife and probably children. He has a family. But he understood the Apostle Paul needs refreshing. How many times have you and me, well, I looked and I didn't see anything. I'm going back home. Onesiphorus sought once, didn't find him. Sought again, didn't find him. He sought and he sought diligently, with earnest, with desire, with patience. He sought earnestly until he found Paul. He didn't just try once and go home. He kept searching and kept searching. How long did it take? We don't know. Bible doesn't say he searched for a day. He searched for a week. Bible doesn't say, but it says that he continued to search and continued to search and continued to search until he found Paul. Now, what are some lessons for us? In spite of our family, we still can and should be a vessel of God. I remember many years ago, different church, different state. Well, I've got a family. I can't come on Sunday morning. We had a lady one time tell us, I've got 2 children and I just can't control them. Let me tell you something. We had 3 children around 5 years of age and under. One was born 83, 185, 188. I was always in the pulpit. My wife managed to control 3 kids by herself. So don't tell me that you can't control little old Junior or Jane. Your family should never, never be an excuse to not be a vessel of God. I'm not saying you totally neglect your family. I'm not saying that you let your family go naked and hungry so that you can give to everybody else. I'm not saying that as fathers, we're not responsible to train them up in the way they should go. But even those responsibilities should never interfere with us being vessels of God. As our children see us serving God, it may encourage them to serve God. I often think of missionaries. And I don't know if you read Brother Brown's letter last week in the bulletin. It was 3 of those pages, the back of our bulletin. It was 3 of those pages, so I had to reduce it to get it on the back of the bulletin. When I do a bulletin, the full letter is almost always on the bulletin board. But if you read his letters, he was very, very close to his family. Very close to his family. But when God called him, he moved over to Thailand. He had not seen his grandkids in, I forget how many years he said since he had seen them. But he did not let his family stop him from being a vessel to God. I think of people who do without physical things so that they can be able to help others. You know, I really had this money set aside to buy a new set of golf clubs. And I'm picking on you because you're the only one that golfs here. Well, 2, we got another one. I've been saving money to buy a new set of golf clubs or a new rod and reel. You know what? So-and-so had a emergency, and I can do without those golf clubs. I can do without that new rod and reel. I can do without that new gun in order to be a blessing to others. Onesiphorus took time away from family, took time away from work, whatever he had going, so that he could go and be and refresh Paul the apostle. Sometimes we all just need a friend. Someone sent me a whole book of one-liners. I found 2 that I thought were very good. It said, a friend is someone you can do nothing with and enjoy it. Think about that one a second. A friend often refreshes us when everyone else is ready to put out our lights. A friend is there. A friend doesn't care the personal risk. A friend doesn't care for the personal loss. A friend is there to encourage. I mean, he had a whole book of those things. I feel sorry for people who don't have a real, true friend. One of the reasons I enjoy going to Bible conferences is it gives me a chance to talk to other preachers and to listen to them and talk to them. And I don't think I have ever been to a conference, but what I came home refreshed. The messages were very good, but it was that face unto face. It was that one-on-one. When I was sick last week, I told you Wednesday night it was supposed to be in Monday, out Tuesday, back to church Wednesday. Well, they never heard of the Murphy factor. Several things went wrong. I was so sick. I was so sick that I didn't care what happened. I really didn't. And I began getting, unbeknownst to anyone, I started getting text messages, emails from friends, pastors, all over the place. I got several cards from different people all over. And you know what? Those texts from friends, those emails, those cards did more for me than being in the emergency room that Friday night did. Friends are there to encourage. They're there to lift us up. Paul had been forsaken, deserted, betrayed. But here came Onesiphorus to refresh him and to meet his needs. God may use you in ways you can't even imagine. That kind word, that helping someone in need, may go farther than your memory will ever be. I think I told you this was several years ago. I was in Sam's over here one day, and I was dressed in, I think I had on blue jeans and a short sleeve shirt. I was picking up a few things, and this lady in a wheelchair, I'm over here, she's behind me. We bump into each other. So I turned around and said, "Oh, I am so sorry." And she said, "You're a preacher, aren't you?" How did she know? She began pouring out her physical, marital, financial problems with her kids. And then, okay, I listened for 15 minutes or so. Then she said, "Would you mind praying for me?" I said, "I'll be glad to pray for you." She said, "Right now, right here, in the middle of Sam's always." We stopped and we had prayer, and she went on and I went on. I didn't go to Sam's that day to encourage anybody, but God put a lady in my aisle behind me in a wheelchair, bumped up against me, so that I could be an encouragement from her, to her. You don't know when, where, or how God is going to use you to be a blessing to someone in need. I get calls, and I'm amazed sometimes. Beside people wanting money, they will call and say, "Are you the pastor?" "Yes, I am." "May I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure, go ahead." "Well, my husband is cheating on me," and they go through, and I've prayed many, many times on the phone with people, trying to, when you say, "Lord, I am here, I am willing, I am desiring to be a blessing and encouragement to refresh others," you might be surprised who God brings across your path that you can be a blessing to. Onesiphorus sought out. Sometimes we have to go the second mile to fully obey God and encourage a friend. Sometimes God just brings people right across our path and says, speak to that man. Speak to that woman. They need encouragement. I have no idea who the lady was, have no idea where she lived. I have no idea anything about her except she was in a wheelchair. But for that moment, God allowed me to be a blessing to a lady in Sam's Isles who needed encouragement. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to have a PhD in psychology. You don't have to have a degree in psychiatry. You don't have to be a professional counselor. Sometimes all you need to be is willing to refresh someone who needs refreshing. How far would you go to help a friend? Father, we come tonight